At various stages in our lives, we contemplate the kind of impact that we hope that we may have around us. Closer towards the beginning of our lives, we look forward and imagine, aspire to the ways in which we hope that our gifts and skills might make a mark in the world. And as we move along, that looking forward becomes a mix of both continuing to look forward to what lay ahead of us, what God is opening up before us, and also looking back as to the ways in which our lives have touched the lives of others and have also lent, through our efforts, an impact that is lasting. The impact of our lives takes place in numerous different spheres, with family and friends, relationally, the way that we hope that others will know us and will come to be able to say about us that we were trustworthy, that we were reliable, that we were caring, that our presence in their lives made their lives better. And when we celebrate lives, the very end of life, as we will do this coming Saturday for Jane Long, we hope that there will be many instances of others' lives that have been touched by ours and that were gifted because God gave us the gift of life in and among one another. Our lives also have impact in the workplace and in the community and the things that we cared deeply about, the things that we devoted ourselves to, not just going through the motions, not just taking up space, but in pursuing things that were lasting and that mattered. And so all of this comes together in creating the scope of a life that we hope and that we aspire to be well lived. Easter season, especially for us, is the time in which we reflect on and contemplate the impact that Jesus' life had. It is the season of resurrection, so it is the time after the span of Jesus' earthly life in which we look for the ongoing implications, the ongoing impacts of the life of the one whom God sent into the world to bring about a new relationship with humanity. The resurrection of Christ is the event that opens the door to Jesus' legacy, but it is just that, an opening, not an ending, but the gateway to the church's taking up the life of Christ in our own corporate life together. So when we think about, in this season of Easter, Jesus' life and what impact it had, what legacy he leaves behind, there's a whole lot of different ways that human lives leave a legacy, some of which don't apply to Jesus the Christ. He did not leave behind any memorial buildings that were named after him because of a bequeath of a part of his estate. Certainly, we come together in churches that represent the presence of Christ in the world, but his was not an ambition to have edifices named after him so people would see his name emblazoned on buildings. He did not leave behind a corporate empire that bore his name, something like Hewlett-Packard or another company that is identified with him as the founder. It's true, we do gather corporately, and our common life together bears marks of the life that he modeled among his friends during his earthly life. But what he was aspiring most to have an impact upon was not corporate policy or bylaws, but instead a relational tone that is ongoing and lived out among his followers. He did not leave behind a revolutionary industrial process. He did not leave behind some world-changing invention. But what he did, and what he strove for in his own life, was to leave behind evidence of God in the lives of other people. This is one important measure for his initial followers. What evidence of God did they bear in their own lives as they lived out the rest of their span of days after Jesus' resurrection? And it is also a marker of your life and my life. What evidence of God is there that we bear because we call ourselves followers of Christ? I have mentioned on another occasion the invitation to self-reflection that goes, if you were arrested for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence that the prosecutor could gather to convict you? And this is a way of thinking about what presence of God, what presence of the life of Christ continues to flow through those of us who are so bold enough to call ourselves Christians in the present day. Here's what a small sampling sounds like of some of the ways that he left that imprint of the presence of God in the lives of others. On one Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue and he encountered a man whose hand was not whole, whose hand was deformed, and he chose to heal that man against the protestations of the religious authorities who said, you don't do that on the Sabbath, that's against the law. On another occasion, he encountered a group of people who were stricken with leprosy and invited the healing power of God to restore them to wholeness. On another occasion, a woman who had been experiencing the pain of hemorrhage for many years was healed just from approaching him. And you can bet that each and every one of those people for the rest of their life never forgot about the impact that their direct and personal encounter with Jesus had had, personal healing that they had experienced. He forgave and offered renewed life to other people, oftentimes other people who had been rejected and put out of acceptable society by their contemporaries. He did this with a fraudulent tax collector by the name of Zacchaeus, by going to Zacchaeus and offering him the opportunity to be restored in reputation and standing in his own community. He did something similar for a woman who was brought to him with charges of adultery. And instead of going along with the bloodlust of the crowd, he convicted all those who had brought her to him about their own brokenness, about their own sinfulness, until no one was left but her and Jesus. And he said, "Go on your way. You have been restored." And he also taught and gave his closest friends and followers lessons about God's wisdom, about God's grace and mercy, and about God's love that they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. He was always in the mode of master teacher, giving a master class on the ways of God, not only in word, but continually through his deeds and actions. Encountered a man who the Gospels describe as a rich young ruler who approached him seeking to find out what the secret to being in God's good graces was. He challenged that man in a way that left him sorrowful. He said, "Go and sell all of your possessions and give the proceeds to the poor, and then come follow me." And this was an extension through action of the teaching, love God with all your heart and soul and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And upon hearing those commandments, the rich young ruler was really glad and excited. I've done all of these since my youth. Then there was the step of, what does that mean? Do this. The words sound pretty, but what are the actions of our life? When he gathered together with his disciples on the eve of his arrest, before his trial and ultimately his crucifixion, he said, "I'm giving you a new commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. By this love, other people will know that you are my followers. And we heard almost those same words in this morning's gospel reading of Jesus telling his disciples, love one another as I have loved you. This is a new commandment that I am giving you. And that word commandment is very definitely the theme of this morning's lectionary. We heard it in the first letter to John. We heard it in the Gospels. And we don't use that word very often in our everyday speaking. It has an edge to it that for many people sounds bossy. Sounds like it's overstepping polite social norms. I command you to do this. I'm giving you a commandment. We don't talk that way to each other very often. But perhaps with something of this little bristle in mind, the first letter to John said, and these commandments that you are being given are not burdensome. The commandments that you are receiving are not a burden. And that's really, really essential for us to internalize. That when we hear that what it means to be lovers of God is to follow God's commandments, some people might receive that as kind of a heavy thing to bear. I have to keep these commandments. Oh, there's all these rules and restrictions. I was having a conversation many, many years ago with somebody who was offering a critique of Christian faith, and she said, it's like it takes all the fun out of it. You can't do this, and you can't do that, and you have to do this, and you have to do that. But when we go deeper into what exactly are these commandments asking us to do in order to live in the legacy of Christ, what we come to realize is, far from being burdensome, they are in fact liberating. They are actually ways of opening us up to experiencing fullness of life and wholeness of being through following the example of Christ. And so that becomes a testimony to Jesus' legacy in our own time. He has already lived out an earthly life, but his followers are the ones who represent what impact, what ongoing implications that earthly life is going to have. And it's not just historical accounts like the ones in the Gospels that I was referring to earlier of healing, of showing mercy and being restored to fullness of life and being taught. It's not just people in the past who have experienced those things, but that continues to happen through the power of God in relationship with Christ in our own time. And we are the bearers of the stories of how that happens. And so this idea of what legacy you are going to leave, wherever you are in your span of life, in your journey of faith, however much you are looking forward and looking backwards, to what degree does the impact of your life align with the ways in which Christ's life made its mark in the world? What opportunities have you had and taken up to bring a healing presence into the life of somebody else who was living and needed comfort, needed support, needed to be lifted up? To what degree have you come alongside somebody who was maybe not seeing others as being in the A-list crowd that everybody wanted to be around, but you looked upon that person in the way that our baptismal vows require us to, seeking and serving Christ in all persons, honoring the dignity of every human being, and you showed them the love of Christ because it had already been shown to you. These are legacy-making actions. These are ways in which you and I can honor through our own words and deeds the commandments that we have received through Christ. This is the way that we live up to the scriptural invitation of Jesus, who says that those who are lovers of God are ones who follow my commandments. And just like any good thing, the more that we practice it, the more it becomes a routine of our lives that we recognize that we need, that we recognize is essential to our own well-being. And we do it again and again and again, and we discover that we didn't necessarily need to be thinking about legacy or making a mark, but it comes to just start happening. And we come to have other people say about the way in which we have lived our lives, that person is a lover of God. That person is faithful. That person took what he or she heard and put it into practice. This is the opportunity for us to be multipliers of blessing, to take the commandments not as burdens or limitations, but as springboards in order to testify through our own lives to the impact that Christ has with us. May that be an invitation that you joyfully take up, that is renewed in your life during this Easter season, and that we bring with us outside of these walls so that others may know that the love of God is alive and well, being exhibited through the lives of God's people, and that others too might be brought into that knowledge of God's love and come to see that those commandments are an invitation for them as well to take up and to follow. Amen.